Welcome to Section 11 of Module 3, where we're going to begin talking in detail about actual licensing activities under the ITAR. Including Section 11, we have 3 more sections to get through the ITAR, so we're really coming down to the wire here. Let's jump right in. So in bullet point 1, depending on the nature of the transaction, DDTC issues different types of licenses. Permanent export of unclassified goods, temporary imports of unclassified goods. We're going to run through a list in just one moment, but those are 2 examples. As we saw in previous sections, persons must be registered with the DDTC prior to submitting license applications. We went through this in some detail, but again, persons, companies, have to be registered prior to submitting a license application. Third bullet point, licenses are required unless an exemption exists. Let's say from the get-go, and we'll put it out front as a trade tip, that ITAR license exemptions are very, very limited. All right, let's have a look at the different types of ITAR licenses. We mentioned a few previously. Let's get into some more detail. Well, the big one is a DSP-5. That is for the unclassified permanent export of articles found on the USML. One thing we want to point out right away here is this word unclassified. We haven't talked much about that. We certainly will in subsequent slides before we wrap up with ITAR. But important to say that we're not talking about classified exports here. It's unclassified. The DSP-73 is required for unclassified temporary exports. DSP-61, unclassified temporary imports, something that we've also mentioned previously. But we're not talking just about exports, but also temporary imports with the DSP-61. With the DSP-85, we're talking about classified exports or classified temporary imports. Let's just say for now that classified exports or temporary imports are a whole different level of controls. As a trade tip, applications for a classified export or temporary import must be done through hard copy submission. We'll see in just a slide or two that predominantly applications for licenses under the ITAR are submitted electronically. In the case of classified exports or classified temporary imports, it has to be done through a hard copy submission. Let's move on. DSP-83. What's called a non-transfer and use certificate. We should point out that this is not technically a license, but a form that must be included as part of a license application to export significant military equipment and classified equipment or data. So as the name would indicate, a non-transfer and use certificate. Certification that articles related to significant military equipment or data will not be transferred in an unauthorized fashion, and a certification of use. DSP-94 is an authority to export defense articles sold under the Foreign Military Sales Program, FMS as it's referred to. We have a whole section on FMS, so we won't get into definitions about that now, but this DSP-94 is really important. And again, not unlike the DSP-83, it's not a license, but an authorization form that must accompany the unlicensed sale of unclassified articles and or technical data in government-to-government foreign military sales. So it's yet another document. Foreign military sales are government-to-government transactions. Let's say that for now. We have a whole section on it later on. The DSP-83 and the DSP-94 are not licenses per se, but certainly additional documentation that have to accompany certain types of transactions. We're going to talk now about license requirements. We've mentioned a few of them already, but as you've noted now, we like to reiterate and drive points home. So the first thing you'll note, license applicant must be registered with the DDTC. We went through that in previous sections, so that is a prerequisite. The DSP-5, DSP-61, DSP-73, and DSP-85 require that all fields are completed on the application where space is provided. You'll note in our sub-bullet point that things like not applicable or see attached just aren't allowed. Last bullet point on this page, as a condition of issuing a license, DDTC may require all documentation relevant to a proposed transaction. We'll see what that is in the next slide. But really what the DDTC is saying is that yes, you have to fill out the application, but there is additional documentation that you'll likely have to provide. Carrying on from the previous slide, some of that additional documentation could be attachments, supporting technical data, or brochures to go along with the application. Second bullet point, and something that we haven't mentioned yet, all freight forwarders must be listed in the application. Freight forwarders play a vital role in the export the permanent export, temporary export, or even temporary import of defense articles. So DDTC wants to know not only who the seller is, who the buyer is overseas, but freight forwarders that are involved, they're going to be physically handling the merchandise. So DDTC wants to know who they are, as well as any intermediate consignees as well. As a best practice, we want to say you should only work with freight forwarders that have demonstrable experience in dealing with defense articles. All freight forwarders aren't the same. In fact, there are many out there that really have no experience whatsoever with defense articles, especially ITAR-related articles. So you want to be sure that you're working with forwarders that have that type of experience. Moving along with license requirements, certification by an empowered official must accompany all applications. There's a definition that we brought forward so many sections ago, that empowered official that has the authority to certify license applications. Applications, as we see in our second bullet point, for commercially sold permanent exports of defense articles must include purchase documentation, a letter of intent, contract, and/or purchase order. In the case of foreign military sales, as we see in our last bullet point, you have to include what is referred to as the letter of offer and acceptance. Remember, FMS, foreign military sales, government-to-government transaction. There has to be a letter of offer and acceptance as part of the overall agreement. Some other ITAR license details. For the DSP-5, DSP-73, and DSP-61, which are the unclassified permanent export, unclassified temporary export, and unclassified temporary import license application, respectively, all of those applications have to be submitted and approved or rejected through what's called DTrade. That's the official Department of State electronic web tool for managing the application process. DTrade, important term we want to introduce there. Should a license application be approved, we see in our second bullet point, they are valid for a maximum of 48 months. And licenses will expire when an expiration date is reached, the authorized quantity in a license is exhausted. A license could very well have a maximum quantity associated with it, or, last sub-bullet point, the authorized value is exhausted. A certain value can be assigned. Now we want to point out on the right-hand side of the page here, this is a screenshot we'll be showing in blown up form in just a moment, but it's that DTrade application page that we'll be showing you. And specifically, as it relates here, the application for permanent export of unclassified defense articles, related tech data, and defense services. This is the opening screenshot when one goes to the DDTC DTrade section of the Department of State Directorate of Defense Trade Control's website. And we want to run through some of the details here to give people an idea of a good resource to work with, but also reiterate some of these key points that we've already made. So right in the center of the page, you'll note DTrade is a fully electronic defense export licensing system. DDTC is prepared to receive and adjudicate defense export authorization requests properly submitted by any U.S. person who is a defense trade registrant and wishes to permanently export unclassified defense articles via the Form DSP-5, temporary import unclassified defense articles via the Form DSP-61, or temporarily export unclassified defense articles via the Form DSP-73. So it's explicitly stating what DTrade is all about. It's the DTrade Information Center. Of equal importance, you'll note on the right-hand side of the page, there are some guidelines that people can use in PDF form for specific license applications. And there you'll see DSP-5, DSP-61, DSP-73, and others. So a great tool to guide people through that application process. So now, as an export perspective, let's have a closer look at the DTrade online application. And as you'll note in the top middle of the page, here we're looking at an application for permanent export of unclassified defense articles, related technical data, and defense services. So this is specific to that DSP-5. One thing we also want to point out, and this reiterates the importance of that whole classified versus unclassified distinction, no classified information can be included in this application. Classified information must be sent separately to PMDDTC in accordance with Defense Security Service guidelines. Classified applications have to be sent in hard copy format. That's driving the point home that we had mentioned earlier. So in terms of how this is set up, You'll note on the left-hand side required documents, that DSP-5, but also right below that optional documents. Certification letter, exemptions to policy letter, basic ordering agreement, a contract, bunch of different things, optional inclusions with the application that people can choose to use to enhance the probability that their application is going to be approved. So this is what the front end of the D-Trade online application looks like. Of course, one has to be actually registered and have a transaction to get into the actual D-Trade. But this is a good representation of what it looks like. Let's have a look at a real-world scenario here that looks at overseas sales that include ITAR and EAR articles and items. What does a company do if they're exporting articles and items, some of which are found on the ITAR and some of which are found on the EAR? This is an advanced real-world scenario because we haven't gotten into EAR just yet. So you'll note that the level of difficulty of these real-world scenarios is indeed becoming more complex. A U.S. company sells articles, services, and technical data that are subject to the USML. However, after a commodity jurisdiction procedure, this should ring a bell for sure, the company also knows that several of the items that it sells are subject to the Export Administration regulations, a mix between ITAR and EAR. What should the seller do when it applies for a DSP-5 license if some items are under EAR and other articles fall under the ITAR? Well, think about that for a minute. It's a tough question, an advanced question, but we'll pop up the answer in just one sec. As we'll see in a moment, pursuant to 123(1)(b) of the ITAR, and only under certain conditions, an application for Department of State licenses may include commodities, software, and technical data subject to the EAR. So you can mix them. It's going to be under specific conditions that the government is either going to say yes or no, but the fact remains, under 123(1)(b), the possibility definitely exists. So where is that found? What is this 123(1)(b)? We've talked about 120, we've talked about 121. We're jumping a little ahead here, so let's have a quick look. So as we often like to do, we want to reference specifically from the ITAR. In this case, you'll note in our title, ITAR 123(1)(b). So this is where we find the answer about the ability to mix EAR items on an application with ITAR articles, defense services or technical data. So let's have a look. Starting in 123.1 at the bottom of the page, moving over to B. Applications for Department of State export or temporary import licenses for proposed exports or temporary imports of defense articles, including technical data, may include commodities, software, and technical data subject to the EAR. Now that's under certain conditions. As we said previously, let's look and see what they are. In B1, the purchase documentation, for example, purchase order, contract letter of intent, etc., includes both defense articles enumerated on the USML and items on the Commerce Control List. So the documentation, the supporting documentation, includes that information, can substantiate that there are ITAR articles and EAR items in it. B2, the commodity, software, and technical data subject to the EAR are for end use in or with the U.S. Munitions List defense articles. They're not separate. They're to be used together. That's what they're trying to say there. And the license application separately enumerates the commodities, software, and technical data subject to the EAR in a U.S. Munitions List paragraph entry. So, yes, we can mix under certain conditions. These are those certain conditions. 123(1)(b). So we're going to wrap up section 11 here and pick up in section 12 on a new topic called agreements under the ITAR. So we'll see you shortly.